Hello, I'm Nick Huntington Client, and right now I'm going to be talking to you about elasticity. So we've been talking about supply and demand. These are the ways in which the quantity supplied, the units that people want to buy, responds to price on the demand side, and quantity supplied, the units that people want to sell, want to respond to price on the supply side. However, so we know that there's going to be this response. It makes sense that as the price goes up, the number of units that people want to buy is going to go down, and vice versa for supply. But how quickly does that change happen? How quickly does that response happen? And that's what elasticity is all about. Elasticity is about how quickly quantity changes in response to a change in the price. You can imagine why this might be different for different kinds of goods. So for example, imagine something that you gotta have, like you can't not buy. So for example, food. You gotta buy food. You can't not buy food. If the price of food went up by 4 times, by 5 times, by 6 times, right, you'd still have to buy more or less the same amount of food to live. Sure, you might change the kind of food that you buy, right, but you'd still have to buy food or else you would perish. So, you know, if the price of food goes up really, really high, you're still going to buy a similar amount of food. Let's contrast that to something like, I don't know, Oreos. Oreos is a type of food, but it's more specific, right? You don't have to buy Oreos, right? Not only are there other desserts and other kinds of food, and there's even other kinds of cookies that are basically the same thing as Oreos. If the price of Oreos went up by 4 or 5 or 6 times, unlike food, you wouldn't keep buying the same amount of Oreos as you were before. You would have to, or you would choose probably to switch to something else, right? So, you know, there's a difference in the qualities of the good that make you respond more or less strongly to a change in the price. The more strongly you respond, the more elastic your response is. You can sort of think about it like a pair of pants. If you're pulling on the waistband of a pair of pants, that's the price changing. If the size of the waistband changes, that's because it's got an elastic waistband. If the size does not change, it's inelastic. It has an inelastic waistband on it. Let's visualize what elasticity looks like on a graph. And the main way that it looks on a graph is that it changes the slope of the supply or demand curves. As opposed to shifting them around the graph, it just makes them steeper or shallower. So let's draw an example. Here we have price. Here we have price. Here we have quantity. Let's do a demand curve first. So let's say here's a demand curve. And then over here on the right, I'm going to draw a different demand curve. And this one is going to have a steeper slope. So it's still sloping down, but it's a lot steeper. So this one over here on the right is going to be a lot more inelastic. And this one over here on the left is more elastic. How can I tell? Well, what we're looking for is how responsive the quantity is to a change in price. Right? That's what we're looking for. And what we have, if we look at the exact same change in price, we can see how responsive each of these curves are. Let's take a price change from, let's say, here down to here. Okay. So we can find what the quantity demanded both before and after the price change is by looking at where that price intersects with the demand curve. So over here on the left, we went from this tall price up here, so there was the quantity we were at, and here's the quantity we are at now. So we get this change in quantity as the price drops. But over here on the right, we go from this quantity to this quantity. So it still changes, right? Inelasticity doesn't mean that it doesn't change at all. It just means that it changes less. And that is, in fact, exactly what we have here. We have that the same change in price leads to a much smaller change in quantity demanded in the inelastic curve. That's why it's steeper. This also works for supply. So, you know, over here on this demand curve, the shallow one, maybe that's more like Oreos. As the price of Oreos goes way up, you might stop buying Oreos. But as the price of food goes up, you're going to still buy more or less the same amount of food, basically until you're spending all your money on food. And then if it goes up anymore, you're going to starve, and that's bad. So let's draw a similar thing for supply curves. So we've got a supply curve over here, and a supply curve that's a lot steeper. This one is going to be the more inelastic one on the right. This one's going to be the more elastic one on the left. And we can see how each of them responds to a price change. As the price goes up, we can see that this one over here on the left has a relatively large increase in quantity. And the one over here on the right has a pretty small increase in quantity. Okay, so the steeper the supply or demand curve is, the less elastic, the more inelastic that response is. So now that we have an idea of how to draw elasticity, what exactly goes into it? What makes something elastic or inelastic? Well, there's a number of things that go into it, and in more detailed materials, if you check out the course materials, you'll see a more detailed list of what's going on. But the two really main ones to focus on are this: flexibility or substitutions, and time. Okay, those are the two big ones. So what do I mean by that? So first of all, flexibility or substitutions. How easy is it to stop buying the thing? Let's go back to the food and Oreos example. So food does not have a lot of substitutes. We've talked about substitutes before. Substitute is a good that sort of does the same thing as the good you're looking at, but it's just a different kind of good. So like butter and margarine are substitutes. If you don't have any butter, you can use some margarine instead. Food does not have any substitutes. If you don't have any food, there's nothing else that can fill in for you that will do the same thing that food generally does. Okay? So the fact that there's no substitute there makes it very inelastic. No matter what the price is, you sort of have to still keep buying food. Okay? There's no substitute. There's not a lot of flexibility that you have in your purchasing decisions. On the other hand, Oreos. Are there substitutes for Oreos? If you couldn't get Oreos, is there something else that you could have that could fill that same gap? Yes, of course. You could get the knockoff Oreos. You could get a different kind of cookie. You could get another entire kind of dessert altogether. You could stop buying cookies if you just felt like it. You could just stop buying cookies. So there's a lot of substitutes for Oreos, so it's very easy to stop buying them. So if the price goes up, you can stop buying them, which makes it more elastic. The presence of substitutions or flexibility in your behavior makes you more elastic. The same thing applies on the supply side. Let's say that you're running a factory and the factory is very specialized. It's a very specialized factory. You can only make one kind of thing. All the employees that you've hired only know how to make one kind of thing. It's like a special kind of microchip that only goes in a toaster. Well, what happens if the price of toasters tanks? Okay, well now you can't really sell your microchip anymore, but what else are you going to do? You can't really retrofit your factory to do anything else because you're so highly specialized. If you're inflexible, then you're going to be inelastic. Okay, whereas if you're more flexible, you can be more elastic. So let's say, for example, you're an actor, and you're an actor in commercials, and the whole commercial market goes bust. Nobody's making commercials anymore. Well, you can take your acting skills and you can go provide them in theater, let's say. So if the price for a commercial actor drops, you can respond by going to doing some other kind of acting thing instead. That makes you more elastic, more flexible. The other thing that I mentioned is time. This also goes back to flexibility, but it takes time to respond to a price change. If the price changes today, you might not change your behavior, but you might change in a little bit. Let's say you went to get your daily cup of coffee at Starbucks, and they had tripled the price. Well, you might still buy it that day, but you'd pretty quickly start looking for other places to get your coffee, or just stop buying your daily coffee altogether, right? So in the immediate term, you might not respond very much, inelastic response. But in the long term, you'd respond quite a bit, an elastic response. A good example of this is with cars and gasoline. When the price of gasoline goes up and down all the time, right? And when it goes up, it makes things like commuting to work a lot more expensive. And if it stays, but you can't really do much about that. If the price of gas goes up and your commute just got twice as expensive, what are you going to do? Move tomorrow? No, it's going to take you a few years to relocate and really respond to that price change. So in the immediate term, you have an inelastic response. But in the long term, you'll buy a more fuel-efficient car, you'll move closer to work, maybe you'll get a bus pass. All those things take time to do, and all those things make you respond more. The more time you have to respond, the more responsive you will be, the more elastic your response will be. This one really especially applies on the supply side. Supply chains are very difficult to change. They take time, right? If your special microchip factory no longer has a buyer, well, you will eventually figure out something else to do, but it's going to take you a lot of time to get there. So in the short run, you're just going to keep making microchips, about as many as you were before, because what else are you going to do? In time, you're going to find new employees and new machinery and new whatever, and you will shift into doing something else. So to sum up, elasticity is a measure of how responsive the quantity supplied or quantity demanded is to change. There's supply elasticity for quantity supplied response. There's demand elasticity for quantity demanded response. We can represent these elasticities with the slope of the demand or supply curve. The shallower the slope is, the more elastic it is. The steeper the slope is, the more inelastic it is, because the same price change leads to a very small quantity change. Why are things elastic or inelastic? It has a lot to do with your flexibility and available substitutes. If you are it's very easy for you to stop buying the thing if the price gets worse for you and go do something else or buy something else, as it might be for Oreos or acting. Well, then, you're going to respond. The price changes, you're going to respond right away because it's easy to respond. Something easy to do, you're more likely to do it, right? And also time. Responding takes time. If you give somebody a day or two to respond to a price change, they might not do it. If you give them a longer period of time, they're going to figure out how to respond to that price change. They'll buy a more fuel-efficient car if the price of gas goes up, that sort of thing. All right, that's the basics on elasticity. Thank you.